What's up? It is RC Apologist here with another episode of the Tillian Thinker. It's been a while again since we've done some of these, so I'm going to try to get into the habit. But again, we haven't had much of an idea of topics to discuss, so because of that, not many chances to go and bring this about. However, we are back, and we're going to try to do what we can to talk about various kinds of issues out there. So today I did want to go over briefly a interesting thought, and this one could be more of an issue of an open forum type to it, because the one thing that is good to talk about is at least various different topics, as well as seeing what can be shared among other people about this. So yeah, feel free to chime in and offer your thoughts in the comments about what is being discussed. Now, the topic of today is going over something known as the logical problem of the Trinity. The logical problem of the Trinity is one argument that apparently has been around in philosophical discussions, but it has not really made much of at least a discussion on most of the forums these days, until a certain individual by the name of the Muslim metaphysician came about and brought it into addressing. Though it has been at least discussed still in the philosophical literature, especially when one of the things that is mentioned is by Bo Branson, who I believe in 2014 wrote a dissertation on the logical problem of the Trinity, explaining what it is, the various different interpretations and views that have been offered, and then more recently there's a book I have called An Introduction to Christian Philosophical Theology by Stephen T. Davis and Eric T. Yang. And one of the chapters that is in this book from 2020 is on the triune God, but when examining it and you go to the chapter, the one thing that is immediately brought up is called the logical problem, and what it refers to, of course, is the logical problem of the Trinity. So with that, allow me to just kind of expound upon what exactly the problem is, because it's even as Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, explains, though some people still try to treat it as if it is a refutation of the Trinity, when it's not necessarily supposed to be a refutation that debunks the Trinity or makes it false. Because there was one Muslim I talked to named Marshall Mathers, a Muslim that I've debated before and other deals, it tries to think that this is a refutation of it when it's not supposed to. The main problem is in the following propositions, and at least this is how it's popularly and mostly formulated. The first proposition being that the Father is God. Then we go on to the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. Main emphasis of the Trinity in reference to the three persons. However, the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, and the Son is not the Holy Spirit. But then the seventh proposition is that there is exactly one God. The issue is about, with these 7 propositional statements, how can we relay it in such a way that it is both logically coherent, hence it's also referred to as the logical coherency or the coherency of the Trinity, and at the same time it is in an orthodox fashion, that it is considered orthodox and biblically consistent as opposed to heretical. Now, other things have been pointed out that Bo Branson is not the only one that really comments on this, and in fact, one of the things that is noted when I tried to find something, there was an AndrewMBailey.com that has a deal on this from Richard Cartwright in Philosophical Essays, where we see this problem stated, and then others have tried to respond to the notion of it. And there are different models that appear on the matter. So, and you can even find most of these on the article on the Trinity, on I believe the Plato Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Yes, that's it from Dale Tuggy, where it was first published in 2009, and it has a revision that occurred in the year 2020, where ultimately the kinds of theories will be, relative identity, Latin Trinitarianism, social Trinitarianism, positive Mysterianism is one particular one, but there's all kinds of different theories of solutions being offered to solve the logical problem. So there'll be things like, what does the is in the statement become? Is it an is of identity? Is it an is of predication? These are the kinds of questions that go into the problem. And I do believe, by the way, that the book Christian Philosophical Theology has a good way of surveying the different models, though it's not an exhaustive list of all the models. That's the unfortunate part. But it at least goes over what's there and offers the strengths and weaknesses that are founded in each particular solution. However, the one particular one that I want to go over is on the matter of, at least in terms of what I view as a solution, as one that is best stated from James N. Anderson, and that it is called the Positive Mysterianism view. So there's the Mysterianism idea, and ultimately it has two sides, the negative and the positive. Negative ultimately states that it is so much of a mystery in the fact that there is little evidence to debate or go over the notion, and thus it is considered illogical in a way, or a paradox to the point that it is not able to be understandable, that it is, as the article from Stanford notes, the Trinity is not understandable because it is too poor in intelligible content for it to positively seem either consistent or inconsistent to us. So that would be a particular view. I forget which one it was, because I know there was a debate between James and Anderson and the other one who would then affirm this particular kind of view of the negative on this particular manner. Though they were more dealing with the issue of the incarnation as opposed to the Trinity. But the model could still be applied to even the logical problem of the incarnation, which maybe one day we'll get to an episode on that. But positive Mysterianism, and again, this is mostly at least how Dale Tuggy defines it, but we'll get to Anderson's sort of like argument for it in a bit. But ultimately it says, quote, "The positive Mysterian holds that the Trinitarian doctrine can't be understood because of an abundance of content. That is, that the doctrine seems to contain explicit or implicit contradictions. So while we grasp the meaning of its individual claims, taken together they seem inconsistent, and so the conjunction of them is not understandable in the sense explained above. The positive Mysterian holds that the human mind is adequate to understand many truths about God, although it breaks down at a certain stage, when the most profound, divinely revealed truths are entertained. Sometimes an analogy with recent physics is offered if we find mysteries, i.e. the apparent contradictions, which will be key to the mention of the argument there, such as light appearing to be both a particle and a wave. Why should we be shocked to find them in theology?" And this is part of the argument of Van and Wagen. And there are several articles, though the main book that really discusses this is founded in James N. Anderson's book on theological paradox. So, Paradox in Christian Theology, Analysis of Its Presence, Character, and Epistemic Status by James N. Anderson, in case anyone wants to try to get a copy of that. But there are articles where we see a response to Dale Tuggy, as well as just kind of expound more on this. And one of these is called In Defense of Mystery, a reply to Dale Tuggy. And it goes over, and I think this is a good introduction to the whole deal, honestly, because it sort of like gets it on the basis of what happens. And so, and as the abstract says, Dale Tuggy in an article tried to mention the two different approaches and then other particular criticisms that are made, because they do go into interactions on these claims that are usually made. But one of the key elements in the Positive Mysterian model is based off of the whole notion of what is referred to as a macrue, or M-A-C-R-U-E. The first part of that, which is expounded upon before it even mentions that meaning, is what is called a MAC, a merely apparent contradiction. And usually when we see that term, the merely apparent contradiction, what it refers to is only the idea that it only appears contradictory at first, but upon further examination, it's not an actual contradiction. It only appears so at first hand. And so, as he states in the article In Defense of Mystery, quote, "Nevertheless, an intelligible distinction may be made between apparent contradiction and real contradiction. Thus, an intelligible distinction may be made between apparent and real contradiction and apparent but not real contradiction. Let us refer to an instance of this latter as merely apparent contradictions. Having dismissed as untenable the idea that the Trinity is generally contradictory, we are left with the possibility that the theological claims suggested by the biblical data constitute a merely apparent contradiction. So how should we understand this merely apparent contradiction? By virtue of what precisely is the contradiction merely apparent? Aristotle famously stated that something cannot be both X and non-X at the same time and in the same sense. Presumably, the temporal qualifier is of no utility here. No one wants to claim, for example, that sometimes only the Father is God, and other times only the Son is God. We are therefore left with a semantic qualifier. Aquinas, doubtless inspired by Aristotle, famously stated that when one is faced with a contradiction, one should make a distinction. Of course, when one can make the appropriate distinctions, one should do so, but one may not always be in a position to specify those distinctions. Nevertheless, knowing that the relevant distinctions could in principle be articulated and explicated is sufficient grounds for distinguishing a merely apparent contradiction from a genuine contradiction. And so he says that when the qualifications are able to be applied, where you are able to make these distinctions, then they are able to be accounted for. And it says that merely apparent contradictions of this kind are thus accounted for by the presence of unarticulated equivocation among key terms involved in the claims. So he says, for the sake of brevity, I will hereby refer to an instance of this phenomenon as a macrue, merely apparent contradiction resulting from unarticulated equivocation. And so with this, the only best way that he's able to really explain and describe this is by offering examples. And they are good examples when you check them out and look at what is being offered. So, for example, he mentions the two propositional statements. Because remember, we're trying to deal with what is called the logical problem of the Trinity, and they are going to be put out as statements. So, the first statement, we see, I am concerned about my wife's operation. The second statement, I am not concerned about my wife's operation. Now, on the surface, these are definitely seeming contradictory. They appear as so because clearly you have am concerned and am not concerned, not indicating the negative in this. And as even the author, James N. Anderson, notes, these statements certainly appear to be inconsistent. But as he goes on to say, quote, yet if you were to overhear me making both claims in a short space of time, you might well think, if you took me to be an honest, straightforward fellow, and he puts that in a sort of like a bracket there, that there must be some alternative explanation for this contradiction than that I was speaking falsely on one or other occasion. You might thus conclude that the contradiction is merely apparent even if you don't or couldn't immediately see why. And you would be correct too, for both A1 and A2, hence the statements of the proposition, so A1 being concerned, A2 being not concerned, were true, but involved an unarticulated equivocation on the term concerned. I was concerned in the sense that I care about my wife's welfare, but I was not concerned in the sense that I was not anxious about the outcome, since I knew that the operating surgeon is one of the best in the world. Naturally, once the distinction is articulated and grasped, the appearance of contradiction vanishes. Yet, both of my original claims were true despite the seeming inconsistency. So, we see that there is a way to be concerned about the wife's operation, but yet at the same time not concerned, and both statements be true even though they appear contradictory. And another example given is the case of what is called Harry, who, quote, a Christian layman who has been invited by a friend to attend a lecture given by an eminent continental theologian. Due to a combination of factors, a previous late night, the stuffiness of the lecture theater, the monotony of the speaker's voice, Harry's attention drifts in and out during the course of the presentation. At one point he hears the following claim: God's kingdom has arrived. The second statement after he dozes off, and only to awaken to catch it, is God's kingdom has not arrived. So, in one statement, God's kingdom has arrived. Second statement, God's kingdom has not arrived. So immediately the thought is that the lecturer has flatly contradicted himself. As he goes on to say, still being a charitable chap by nature and working on the assumption that an eminent continental theologian would be unlikely to exhibit such flagrant illogicality, he quickly concludes that the speaker has in mind a distinction according to which God's kingdom has arrived in one sense, but has not arrived in another. Having tuned out for most of the lecture, Harry is unable to say just what distinction is operative here. But nonetheless, he is justified in believing that some distinction is operative, and therefore that this is a macrut. He reasons that the crucial distinction could be explicated by the source of the claims, if by no one else, and the appearance of inconsistency thereby removed. And then there's a bracket note to say, Harry decides, however, not to pursue this information, but to pursue some strong coffee instead, because, he's tired, he needs to wake up, and that's a good thing, at least there. Now, a final example that's given in this, but there, from what I gather from looking at some of the Paradox in Christian Theology book, is that he does go explaining a whole good chunk of different analogies, but this is one of the key ones that I think helps out. One final, subtler example. Reflect on the situation faced by Susan, who's presented with the following two claims about one and the same human individual. First statement, Jamie has an XY chromosome pair. The second statement, Jamie is an attractive teenage girl. So, Susan hears about Jamie, and here's these two statements. Although they, do not explicitly contradict in the same way that the others have, there's what we call an implicit contradiction, because we see that according to statement 1, XY chromosome pair, Jamie is a male. But then we have statement 2, Jamie is an attractive teenage girl, which implies that is not a male. Jamie is not a male, but rather is a girl. But if someone who knew Jamie well and in the relevant respects, such as Jamie's family doctor, were the source of these claims, and Susan had a good reason to believe this person to be speaking truthfully, then she would be rational in taking this to be a macrut. The actual state of affairs lying behind claims 1 and 2 is this. There exists a rare medical condition known as male pseudo-hermaphroditism, in which an embryo with an XY genotype nonetheless develops physiologically as a female. Thus, the apparent contradiction can be fully resolved once it is understood that there are various distinct senses in which a person can be male or female. In this case, Jamie is genotypically male, but phenotypically not a male. Nevertheless, Susan need not to be aware of this phenomenon, let alone have any medical understanding of how it works, to believe with good reason that Statement 1 and Statement 2 constitute a makruh. And apparently from what I've read as well, this argument is more based around the concept of what can be read in Alvin Plantinga's work on warrant, regarding these ideas being warranted beliefs, that we have a justification to believe in such a thing. And so the argument ultimately is that the Trinitarian statements and the problem, as well as just Trinitarian doctrine in general, is what we would call then a makruh. And as he states himself in the argument, my basic proposal is that genuine theological paradoxes such as the Christian doctrine of the Trinity are best understood as merely apparent contradictions resulting from articulated equivocation. The logical conflict in question is rarely, if ever, explicit. The Son is God and the Son is not God. So that is, if you can remember what we stated earlier regarding the propositional statements, that the Son is God, but at the same time, we have other things regarding the different statements where we see the Holy Spirit is God, but the Son is not the Holy Spirit. They may constitute, so as it states here, the logical conflict in question is rarely, if ever, explicit, such as saying, again, the Son is God and the Son is not God. But they may constitute a formal contradiction, as seems to be the case with the set of the claims that Tuggy analyzes. In other cases, the perceived contradiction will be merely implicit, but no less awkward for that. Moreover, these apparent contradictions in our formulations of Christian doctrine will be the product of theological theorizing from source data that also strikes us as implicitly contradictory. After all, the Bible nowhere makes any explicitly or formal contradictory statements about God's triune nature, but rather supplies copious data about God from which we infer the sort of neat, succinct set of statements which serve as a formal statement of orthodox Trinitarian beliefs, such as the Athanasian Creed or Tuggy's formulation and statement. Furthermore, these doctrinal inferences are not conducted in an epistemic vacuum, so to speak. They draw on a considerable amount of extra-biblical background knowledge and prior experience about those concepts and categories employed by the biblical text, including natural intuitions about conceptual entailments and metaphysical necessities. So, there's not much I can go in for this episode, unfortunately, on this, but hence I will at least link the articles below, so that way you can have a look into this, as well as a link to the Amazon page, so y'all can order the Introduction to Christian Philosophical Theology if you're a Christian that's looking for a much easier explanation, as well as a survey of some of the particular models. But just keep in mind again that with the solution, could there be another one that I'm open to? Yes, and hence if someone's able to explain it in the comments, they can do that. But this is an interesting philosophical problem that I think needs to be addressed, just like I say the logical problem of the one in the many needs to be addressed, because it does have some implications and problems that could be done in how one's engagement of their theology goes. Just like how the logical problem of the one in the many poses serious metaphysical and epistemological issues for one, I think then the logical problem of the Trinity sort of sits as such an issue that I think the Christians need to be aware of and try to solve. So, with that, main thing that I just want to kind of briefly touch on for people at that point to kind of go over is just when trying to discover a solution to the problem, you have to make sure again that it's logically coherent and then biblically consistent, because it's definitely difficult, and that's why social Trinitarianism, Latin Trinitarianism, I'd have to look more into relative identity on my further analysis of that, but the point is that if you're not careful in how you articulate the means, you can either render it to being illogical but yet still biblically consistent, or it's still logical but yet you fall into heresy. With the positive Mysterian model, I believe we can get to an issue where it's not really illogical, because again, it's only merely apparent contradictions, but you still at least have the biblical formulation. Once you then articulate it more properly, that's when immediately the distinctions and the articulations help, and thus negates contradiction, putting it as something that is quite logical. But that being said, this has been RC Apologist. Tune in next time, and until then, take care.